Welcome, and thanks for tuning in. I'm Lynn Berger, host of Lynn Berger Interviews Remarkable People. And today I have the pleasure of speaking with Mark Scheerer. Mark is a versatile and talented media professional that has traveled the world. And today we're going to be speaking about how this all happened, perhaps from the beginning. And I really hope all the viewers are going to learn a lot and have a lot of fun through this interview. So thank you, Mark.
My pleasure.
Okay. So take us back to your earlier years. And do you know what you wanted to do when you were younger?
Absolutely not, Lynn. I was a big sports fan, and that is kind of a clue as to what happened. And there's this sports term that I like. It's in contemporary usage. If a player is not performing well, someone will snidely say, well, I think he's suffering from a torn motivator cuff. Not a rotator cuff, a motivator cuff. He's not brimming with ambition. And that's the way I was in high school. Of course, this was back in the 1960s when there wasn't as much pressure on young people, I don't believe, as I understand there is today. So I felt a little bit of pressure to decide what I wanted to be. So I said, well, I love sports. I'll just play sports by being a coach. I'll major in physical education. So I went off to college in Ohio and started majoring in physical education, having fun playing sports. But again, this was the 60s, and I started changing as the times changed around me. My hair got longer. My politics moved towards the anti-Vietnam War side. I was experimenting with marijuana, and I realized that student teaching was coming up. After 3 years of majoring in phys ed, I was about to go to a high school and teach phys ed, and I would have to cut my hair and change my appearance. And I just said, I've got to drop out. And I drove home to New Jersey, where I was from, and I got home late at night. And my dad heard the car in the driveway, came out and said, hey, welcome home, son. And I said, Dad, I'm quitting school. I have to find myself. I'm going to hitchhike around the country and discover myself. Because again, this was the 60s. And he was so great. He just said, son, we'll talk about this in the morning. Mm-hmm. And this is a few days later is where a friend of mine stepped in and helped me understand exactly what I should do. He said he had either dropped out or flunked out or been kicked out of a couple colleges already. And he said, you've got 3 years under your belt. You've got enough for a minor in phys ed. Just change your major. And I said, well, to what? And he said, didn't you write for the high school newspaper? And I said, yeah, a little bit. And he said, didn't you enjoy that? And I said, yeah. And did people say that you wrote well? And I said, yeah, come to think of it, they did. And I went back to school instead of hitchhiking around the country, changed my major to journalism, fell in love with it, had great professors right out of the chute. And I graduated with a degree in print journalism, but I got my first job in radio news in a little town, Toledo, Ohio. So that's how it started.
Well, the fact that you listen to your friends, that's good advice by itself.
And we are still good friends to this day. I wrote about him in the introduction to my book because he played this unwitting role. But by the way, my friends weren't done. I graduated and then was working as a night watchman because, again, I wasn't actively looking for a job. I had the degree. I said, I don't know what's next. I was working late one night and I heard a rock radio station playing album cuts. And I told my friend, another friend the next day, I've got something to listen to tonight. And he said, wait, where are they? They're from right up the road in Toledo, Ohio. Why don't you call them and see if they need a news director? And I said, well, I don't think they do. And he said, go ahead. And I called and they said, as a matter of fact, we're looking for a news director. And then I said to my friend, well, I don't have a car. How am I going to get up to Toledo? He threw me his car keys and said, here, go. And so two friends, lit a fire under me. And to this day, I'm eternally grateful to them.
Well, that is a great story on two occasions. And you were a night watchman listening to the radio?
Yeah, and perfectly content, saying, well, I was still in the college town, which is a fun place to stay. You don't have to grow up if you stay in your college town. And right. I was delighted that there was going to be some good radio to listen to. And then the next thing I knew, I was on the radio.
Wow, that is quite a story. So what happened when you started that position? How did it go initially?
Like I said, I did the print journalism curriculum, newspapers, and I didn't even work at the campus radio station because I was shy. I thought I was afraid to go into a radio studio, not be seen, but let my voice be heard because I was shy. So I go to the radio station, and they had a news director who was leaving. And I said, if I go out with my tape recorder and I interview somebody, how do I get the parts of that interview on the air? And he said, well, you go over there to that rack and you get a cart. And I looked around the newsroom and I didn't see a shopping cart. I didn't see a basket. I said, what are you talking about, a cart? It was a cartridge, like the 8 tracks that we put in your car sound system back then. But this was a broadcast kind, and you dubbed off your interview onto a cartridge. And then when you went on the air, you said, we spoke to the mayor a few minutes ago, and he said, and you press a button and the soundbite would play. So I was learning on the job doing radio news. Luckily, I somehow was able to learn quick enough and became pretty good at it.
Well, a lot of people would love to be able to duplicate that story. And it took courage, and, you could have said no, but you didn't. So that's to your credit.
Well, they say that, it's better to be lucky than good. You got to be a combination of both, because if you're lucky enough to get your foot in the door and get a job, you better be good at it. And from Toledo, I started climbing the market ladder in radio. I moved to Cincinnati, and then Philadelphia, and then Chicago. And then one day, an ad in a trade magazine, Broadcasting Magazine, had this headline: if you think this is the greatest job in radio, it could be yours. We want you to go anywhere anything of interest to young people is happening around the world. And this was in 1983. And I was still young enough, I was in my early 30s, to say, I could cover what young people are doing. And everyone in radio went after this job. It was designed for someone who had a foot in both worlds: real news, hard news, and also music news, rock and roll news, news about marijuana legalization, young people's issues and stuff. And I went after the job at ABC Radio News here in New York City and got it. And true to their word, ABC immediately sent me around the world in pursuit of news. I went to Lebanon to hang out with Marines who were there at the time in 1983. I covered the Grenada invasion. I covered famine in Ethiopia and Sudan. And the job, unfortunately, only lasted 6 years, because it was a big ticket item for even a successful network like ABC News. They didn't keep me on the road constantly. I would come back to New York, and then while I was in New York, interview musicians or movie stars and stuff, and then go out on the road to do that kind of globetrotting work that I did, which it was mind blowing, and it was enough to make me examine, how did I get so lucky? But you won't believe this, Lynn, but with my first job in radio news, when I started talking to people in radio, the common wisdom in 1972 was women will never anchor the news on radio because
that's not true.
their voice isn't believable enough, or something like that. And at the time I said, well, yeah, okay, sure. If that's the conventional wisdom, I guess. Well, things have changed a little.
Women have come a long way with that. That's for sure. Well, thank you for sharing that. What would really, when I saw that advertisement, and we're going to get to your book for the job, that was such an original, creative ad looking for someone.
If you think this is the best job in radio news, it could be yours. Who's not going to go after that?
Well, I don't even think they had to put in, such a great, ad for a job like that, because I'm sure they would have gotten a lot of applicants, and there were a lot of applicants. And do you remember the process of having to really interview and share your successes?
It caught me by surprise. They called me up and said, okay, we got your application. Here's what we want you to do. Pretend that you've had the job for the last 6 months. pretend and look ahead at the coming 6 months and send us a list of stories that you would have covered and you will cover if you get this
Mm,
job. And
mm.
I said, oh my goodness. So I worked real hard and sent them a list, and they called back, and I said, oh, they're calling me back. And they said, that was good, but it wasn't really enough. Can you come up with some more? I immediately called anyone I knew outside of where I was and asked them, what's going on in your town? What are young people doing? I went to an out of town newsstand back then. Toledo was a big enough city to have an out of town newspaper stand. I bought every newspaper I could find. I rifled through it, and I came up with enough story ideas that they said, okay, you are one of the finalists. And they flew 5 people into New York, one at a time over the course of a week, and interviewed them further. And then they made their decision. And
What a
and I,
process.
you know, I felt pretty optimistic, but I was prepared for like, oh, your story ideas really weren't all that good. We had to ask you twice,
You're right.
but I won. I won the
Well,
lottery.
that's a great story. And that's also something for people to think about, to really, even if you're not asked through an interview, to perhaps prepare something. And that was a great way to show your work and show the way you think. And
Yep.
that's another great story. So lead us through after that job. What happened then? And share some, noteworthy experiences.
Well, so I go off and I do this job, and they send me everywhere. I went to the Soviet Union to cover Billy Joel's concerts there in Moscow, and because that was a perfect rock and roll meets the world story. The combination of social issues and politics, geopolitics, and rock and roll. And so it was a fantastic job. And I would run into a television guy who worked out of New York for the NBC owned and operated stations. And we would be walking down a beach at spring break in Florida or in the desert in Sudan. And he and his crew were there. And he said, you and I are always going to the same places. He said, but I envy you so much because you just carry that little tape recorder over your shoulder and some cassettes. And I got to travel with a cameraman, a sound man, and a producer. So I really had one of the best jobs in broadcasting. But I had a friend who was on television in New York that I met in Cincinnati, my Cincinnati days. He was a sportscaster. He said to me, Mark, you've got to get on television. I said, why? I have one of the best jobs you'll ever find in broadcasting. It just happens to be on radio. And he said, well, please just meet with my agent. I met with the agent. She said, do you, I told her what I did for ABC Radio. And she said, are you going to that Billy Joel concert that's coming up? And I said, yes, I am. And she said, well, I know the executive producer of Good Morning America at your own company, ABC. And I'm going to ask him if he could give you a chance to do some television news stories from Moscow while you're there. And Jack Riley, the head of Good Morning America, said, sure, let's give it a try. Because I was already on ABC's payroll. And so I did my first 2 television news stories from Moscow, one on rock in Russia and the other on Billy Joel's opening night. And when I got back, Jack Riley took me to lunch and said, you want to be our pop music correspondent from now on? I said, you bet I do. Wow. And then so they had to pay me, ABC had to pay me more. But the 2 jobs overlapped. When I would do a television interview, I'd have a audio tape recorder rolling, and I'd do radio stories, and then I would do the GMA story. But that, again, because this was the beginning of the consolidation and the shrinkage of the news industry overall, and ABC had been bought by capital cities and then bought by Walt Disney. And every step of the way, they laid people off, as so often happens. So I found myself sort of totally without a job for several months until I got contacted by a guy that I met in a war zone who was producing a show on CNN called Showbiz Today. It was a daily half-hour show like Entertainment Tonight or Access Hollywood, only at CNN, it was taken a little more seriously. We didn't do puff pieces so much as we did trend pieces and issue pieces. And there was nobody on the staff at that time who had hard news experience like I did. So I was hired to to be a entertainment correspondent. And of course, at that point, I realized, I may never be able to go back to hard news. I've gone to, they call sports the toy store of journalism. I'm not sure what they call entertainment news, but it's probably something as dismissive. But it didn't matter. I spent 12 years at CNN interviewing movie stars, rock stars, but also covering issues like parental guidance with X-rated lyrics in music. I interviewed Tipper Gore when she came up with the idea of parental advisory stickers. I covered the House hearings in Washington on it, where Frank Zappa gave an impassionate response to Tipper Gore, which I won't say here. But so that was a wonderful job too. And so along the way, I started to realize, I've covered everything from the fluffiest piece of, like, the red carpet at the Grammys to wars and famine. And most people take jobs in journalism that are on one side or the other. I just did everything in between and then everything on both sides. And that's a little unusual. So I thought there might be a material here, although I didn't think of a book right away. If you want, I'll tell you how I came around to deciding to put all this down between the covers of the book.
Yes, I want to get to the book. And I also want to ask you, how do you, when you look at how your colleagues in your work, and they really stayed in segmented markets, what do you think it was that allowed you, to be able to do all those things, to have the skill? And how do you think it all happened for you when you look back?
That's a really good question. I do recall way back before anybody was asking me what I wanted to do for a living, when I was like in junior high school or even grade school, I would read, there was an afternoon newspaper that was delivered to our door every day, and I would read it every day. I don't know why. I liked to read. I had an older sister who's 2 years older than me, who, when she started learning how to read, she started grabbing her little brother and saying, "Here, I'm going to teach you how to read." So by the time I got it to, first grade, I was a little bit ahead of everybody. But I must have had some curiosity about the grown-up world, because I read the newspaper all the time. And in high school, we had to get a subscription to the New York Times for our social studies class.
Right.
And in study hall, I would be reading the sports page of the New York Times. And I wound up decades later writing a regular weekly column about college hockey for the New York Times. And I think back to those days when I was, instead of studying, I was reading the sports pages of the New York Times, and I never would have believed where I would wind up.
Yeah, I mean, you make a good point about a paper like the New York Times. If you read all sections, you're very educated on many different topics. And I always recommend to people, when they're kind of searching for what's next for them, read all the topics, like read all the sections, because you don't know what's going to grab you.
You couldn't be more right, Lynn. In my neighborhood hangout, we watch Jeopardy at night. And modesty aside, I'm among the best at it, because I read a newspaper from cover to cover every day of my life, practically. So some of that stuff gets stuck in your head as trivia.
Absolutely. Great. Thanks for filling us in on that. Now, I do want to get to your book and what you're doing now. So, this is quite a book. I want to bring it to everyone's attention. It's a fun book to read. And tell us about how that book, how it started, as you said, and your experience writing it, about all your experiences.
Well, I had 3 nephews. And as they were growing up, I was doing all this globetrotting and having all these adventures. And they grew up hearing me tell stories. And it got really interesting when I started covering popular musicians that they knew and liked. And they were like, "Oh my gosh, you interviewed Notorious B.I.G." I said, "Yeah, I did." And they would say, and I had my one nephew in particular said, "Uncle Mark, you've got to write a book." And I said, "Well, it's not that simple. I'm not, my name is not a household word. I'm not famous enough to get a book published by a legitimate publisher on my name alone. And the events that I covered were widely disparate, varied, but I didn't cover any earth-shaking events like an entire World War II or something like that. So I said, I'm not going to get a memoir published. And so my nephew said, well, have you heard of a blog? Do you know what that is, Uncle Mark? And I said, yeah, I know what a blog is. And he said, start telling your stories in a blog. And over a 2-year period, I wrote out 134 blog posts. And then one day it dawned on me, each of these posts could easily be put into a book as a chapter.
Mm-hmm.
And I did that. And nowadays you can self-publish a book and everybody can buy it. And that's what I did. It came out in December.
Yeah, no, it's a great book. I mean, each page is like another experience. How, when you look back at it, it must have seemed, how was it when you look back at all these things you did? What were your feelings about that?
Well, number one, I was glad that I have a pack rat mentality. I
Mm-hmm.
took pictures wherever I went. And when I got to the network level, the ABC publicity people said, we can't go with you when you go to Ethiopia to cover famine relief, but make sure you take a camera and have people take pictures of you,
Mm-hmm.
in a refugee camp, for example.
Mm-hmm.
So I collected a whole bunch of photographs and video and audio. And so that really worked on the blog. But imagine my disappointment when I realized you can't play video or audio in the pages of the book. It's a shame, but you can steer people to the blog where they can hear the stories and the outtakes and mistakes. There's bloopers. A good news organization has a holiday party where they play the blooper reel, and so I made my share of bloopers.
Okay. No, it's a great book. It's a fun book, and it's, quite unbelievable that you were able to do, all that, go from radio to television to entertainment to serious war type of stories. I mean, it's really quite vast. And it's great for you to be able to have it yourself, to open it up, to remind yourself what you did.
After I got my first copy, I sat down and read it from cover to cover, even though I wrote the stuff and it's there in the blog. And that is an experience, reading your own book. I mean, I never occurred to me. I don't think I ever heard of an author say, hey, what was it like the first time you read your book cover to cover? It was like, I think I was right. I think there was stuff in here that people want to read.
Yeah, no, it was a lot of fun, and a lot of experiences. Now, where you are today, what are you doing? I know work has always been a very important part of your life, and what are you doing now, and what does your life look like?
I have kept my hand in journalism one day a week. I am an editor at Public News Service. It's a 25-year-old, started out as a radio news service, serving state media, mostly radio. We did radio news stories. I covered New York State with another person. You interviewed people on the phone. I didn't have to go to Albany. I was in New York City, but I could interview anybody in the state because it was for radio. And this organization grew and grew, and I wound up getting tired of doing the producing of these stories. And now I'm just an editor, and we have producers around the country. And one day a week, I'm on the desk fielding their stories, accepting them, rejecting them, copy editing them. And that one day a week is enough for me to feel like I'm still a working journalist. But then I have time the rest of the week to work on my blog and my book. And there will be a second book, because when I went back after the first one was published and looked at the blog, I said, well, I forgot to put that story in the book. Oh, and that one's just as good as the ones that are in the book. And there's enough for a second book.
Right. Well, it seems like you've done everything from local to national to international.
To sports writing, which, kind of takes me back to where I thought I'll just play sports all my life.
Well, this has been so interesting, and I would love to ask you any advice you would give to young people that, or not even young, I mean, some people, second, third, fourth careers, to get into the type of work you did. Is there any advice you can share?
I've been asked throughout my career by people whose sons and daughters are considering a career or majoring in journalism, and we went through a period where everyone did, and post Watergate, and then we went through a period where no one, it became a joke. Yeah, you want to make no money whatsoever, major in journalism. I still say it's the most worthwhile endeavor I can think of. And there are still ways to practice it, and they are open to entrepreneurship. These days, you could start your own neighborhood news outlet with access to the internet. We have these small scale news organizations, like here in New York, we have the West Side Rag and the Upper West Side. I love the Upper West Side. These are all micro journalism outlets. And if you're just graduating with a degree in journalism and you love to write news stories, call them up, send them a story saying, hey, I know somebody in your neighborhood who's an interesting story, or there's an issue that I'm aware of. Can I write my story there? If you get a few of those published, then you've got something to send to a larger news organization. It's a good time for people, would-be journalists with an entrepreneurial spirit who can pronounce
Great
the word
advice.
entrepreneurial.
Great advice. And this is going to be on Manhattan Neighborhood Network. So there we go. Is there anything else that you would have liked to have chatted about today that we didn't get to?
I could tell some embarrassing stories about where things went wrong. Some of those are in the book, but
Okay.
I don't want to take up valuable time with that.
Well, we'll keep that suspense for getting the book, and you just don't know what you're going to find. So this was a great afternoon chat. I really appreciate your time and all the advice and experiences you shared with us, and looking forward to your next book. So thank you. Thank you.
I'll get to work on it right away. Thank you, Lynn.
Okay. Take care now. Thanks.